Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the HR Huddle. I'm your host, Teri Zipper, CEO and Managing Partner at Sapient Insights Group. And I'm back for another exciting episode of HR We Have a Problem. This is the show where we like to break down the big and most relevant issues of the day. We help you make sense of what they mean, and we talk about what you might do about some of them. Joining me today is Dr. Scott Dust. Scott is a highly published management professor at the University of Cincinnati and the Chief Research Officer at Cloverleaf, an automated assessment and coaching solution. I first met Scott a few years ago when we were doing some people assessments and started to do some work with Cloverleaf, which was a very interesting system. Welcome, Scott. Great to catch up.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited for the conversation.
Yeah, me too. As our podcast is aptly named HR We Have a Problem, I wanted to talk about one of the challenges that I see, and particularly in the area of assessment and how this is evolving and what we should expect to see in this particular area, because there's some exciting new things happening in the world and it's having a big impact in this area, I think. Does that sound like a good plan to you?
That sounds great. Yeah. Assessments are one of my favorite topics. I think a lot is going to change in the near future. And it's fun to riff on some of these up and coming big changes that are underway.
Yeah. Well, then let's get into the huddle and we can talk about some of those changes. So it's interesting. I mean, the process for assessing people, particularly employees, has been around forever, right? 100 years of performance management. At a time, I'm sure it seemed like a very forward-thinking process, but obviously we've evolved, work has evolved, everything has gotten more complex. And I see the culmination of assessments, performance management, alongside advances in AI that are helping us already improve the feedback process, help us with productivity. But I think there's a lot more we could do, right? And a lot of things now are kind of on that cusp. And I think the other thing is we need to think about all the money we've spent over the last number of years in assessments and how we can start to take advantage of some of that with what's happening in the world.
I agree. I definitely agree with all of the above. Yeah, I think there's a big change in the utility of assessments and the delivery of those assessments in particular. So maybe let's start there. If that's okay with you. And
yeah. I mean, and you wrote a really fascinating article earlier this year that was focused on what you called radical disruption to the assessment industry. So, I was very fascinated by that. So I don't know if that's where you're going, but we can go there as well. I'll let you finish.
No, absolutely. Yes, those disruptions are exactly what I had in mind. So I can frame it as a story. Like if we really think back to how assessments were first used, literally almost exactly 100 years ago, it was a tool for assessing intelligence that would be used to decide whether or not someone should be hired for a specific position. And these assessments were measuring all sorts of quirky stuff, to the degree where they were looking at things such as handwriting and the way that they smiled when they first met somebody. And we've come a long way since then.
Oh, yeah.
And now there's tools that obviously make you way more accurate in interpreting the predictive behavior and the degree to which they might be aligned with a specific position. But it wasn't that long ago, 100 years ago, we were using assessments that were incredibly, not just off-putting, but also very inaccurate. And over time, they started to realize that it really isn't just one thing that you're trying to assess. People are a complicated mix of psychographic characteristics. And a lot of times when we're looking at assessments, we're looking at What are their traits by themselves? What are their strengths by themselves? What are their motivational drivers by themselves? And it's becoming relatively clear over time that it necessitates knowing the profile of the individual across all these different characteristics. Knowing just one thing isn't really enough. Like, we have the data to actually look at the interactions between these different characteristics, but we still look at one at a time. So the right mix, I think, is kind of the first part of it. The second part of it is the right amount. So we assume that more is better on a lot of assessment dimensions. And that is not always the case. The research is being pretty clear in showing that sometimes moderate amounts of a certain characteristic are actually ideal for different contexts, or there's kind of a cliff. You get to a certain level, and being more than that isn't all that helpful. And again, we have the data and we have the capability to analyze the data, but we still assume this very linear thinking in terms of understanding assessments and behavior, or assessments and performance, or the outcomes of those assessments and performance. So that's the first one. The right mix and the right amount.
Can you give an example of, what you mean by the amount? So is it kind of that old adage of everything in moderation?
Yeah, absolutely. You could use that adage for a variety of different characteristics. One in particular, stress, for example. There is this model that would suggest that when you don't have enough stress, it's under arousal and you're actually bored. When you have too much stress, it's over arousal, and that's when you get to burnout. So there is a functional degree of stress when you have challenging stressors as opposed to hindrance stressors. So right there, right, we look at stress and we say, oh no, it's not good that people are stressed, but it's good to have the right amount of stress and the right source of stress. So that's one example. But then also things like extroversion. People might assume that the best sales representatives extroverts, and they assume that has to do with their ability to socialize and their ability to be more verbal and influence individuals. But there's been research done to illustrate that actually ambiverts on average end up being better salespeople than extroverts, because they need to be able to do two different things. They need to be able to be influential and talk and socialize, but they also need to be able to be great listeners and processors, and to really be able to think through what someone is saying and why they're saying it, to really kind of understand their problem in a way that they can then deliver a solution. So again, the moderation effect rules. And then also a lot of times I've done lots of analysis for organizations that are basically trying to figure out, how do we increase the extent to which people are adaptive or innovative or have executive presence, you name it. And a lot of times when they do their pre-post test, what they find is that on average, the organization is an 8 out of a 10, right? And they do the training and then it moves up to an 8.5. And interestingly, that's a huge investment for what ends up being a relatively minor increase in a variable that actually isn't solving the problem you were shooting for. So understanding where to make the better investment dollars and what are the characteristics that you really care about, that's getting at this idea of too much of a good thing effect, or enough is enough effect.
Gotcha. Yeah, that was fascinating to me. I mean, I think we all kind of recognize that there's always too much of a good thing, right? So that never works quite right. And I liked the analogy of having the right amount. It is that right mix in any situation. So I think that's going to be important as we think about how some of these technologies will support helping us get to that right mix as well.
Right. Yeah.
So the next area that you talked about was really how to move from static to dynamic. And this seemed obvious, but there's a lot more there than meets the eye, right? Again, you've got sort of what's the right mix? How much is too much? And how do we support it?
Yeah. And that's the second big change I think that people are starting to recognize, in that a lot of times assessments, when you take them, you get your results and it is pretty static. This is what you are. And it fails to recognize a few different things. Number one, that we do change over time, and we have different things that matter at different points in our life, in different roles, and different obstacles that we have. And so understanding that if anything, change is inevitable, including us as human beings. Now, different characteristics are more stable than others. For example, traits are relatively stable across time and space. By definition, that's what traits are. But also they do change as we age, and eroticism goes down, conscientiousness goes up, agreeableness goes up a little bit across the decades over long periods of time. So even the most stable psychographic does change a little bit as we age. But things like strengths, a lot of times you learn new skills, and it's the best application given the setting of those learned skills. And we're always learning and growing and developing. So our strengths should evolve over time. Inevitably, our values change based upon life events. So my values are very different than what they were when I first graduated college versus where I am now with obligations and responsibilities to family. And we take for granted the fact that we actually are changing every day. And so assessments that are more capable of understanding that dynamic impact are going to be more accurate. And then as well, we don't need everything all the time. There might be things that are more dormant that become very relevant given specific circumstances. A meeting with a specific type of person, a specific type of challenge or stressor, being in crisis mode versus in maintenance mode. Those contexts, those situations all dictate specific types of psychographics that are important or less important. And assessments need to be able to adapt to that. Because if they can't, then they just become too much information and overwhelming and not all that useful in the moment. So how can you construct something that evolves with you in time and space is the million-dollar question.
Yeah. Right. I agree. I think thinking about that's typically how we did things in the past, right? You took assessments every couple of years, right? People actually change probably more than that. And this is why people go through training and they spend time themselves learning new skills and focusing on bettering themselves because they want to change. They want to be dynamic and improve those capabilities. And the old way was just not really highlighting those areas where people, maybe a visible skill that you suddenly had, but a lot of other things may not be as visible outside of your direct supervisor or manager in terms of a change.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a great example recently is COVID. And that was a big life event. I mean, that's the type of event that people will be talking about as a temporal landmark for a long time, pre and post COVID.
Yes.
And interestingly, at Cloverleaf, when we have all these assessments across millions of people, and to be able to see changes across time has been something I've always been very interested in. So all the assessments have very high test-retest reliability, meaning if you take it today and then you take it tomorrow or a week or whatever, you're going to see very similar results. But then you also have inevitably some change for some assessments based upon life experiences and different chapters of life, et cetera. And some of that is normal. That is to be expected. But when you have big life changes, you theoretically should see even more substantial changes in how people operate. And so some of the assessments that are maybe more so focused on like worldview or values, those saw bigger changes than those that are more trait-based and strength-based. So as predicted, that's to be expected. And that means everything's working correctly. But I think people take for granted that sometimes they do regroup and they think through how their life is different after big moments in their life. I did one study that we looked at pre and post COVID for a peer-reviewed publication in Journal of Applied Psychology. And the interesting question was, why in the world during COVID would people consider leaving would they consider leaving their organization to a greater degree? Because during COVID, things were very in flux, and it would be very risky to leave your organization, given that you don't really know how your organization is going to do, given the societal impact of COVID. So it really was fascinating that there was this huge increase in interest in other organizations or job hopping or just leaving the company. Like, why would that be? And so what we found was that people, when they experienced COVID, had a huge surge and increase in what's called a need for meaningfulness. They became more in tune with, why am I doing what I'm doing, and why is it important? And does it fulfill my values and my needs? And basically this reflection of, what the heck am I doing on earth here? Like, what is the whole point? And what we found was that those that currently felt as if their job was high in meaningfulness, they did not see any change during COVID in their intent to turn over. But those that felt a low sense of meaningfulness in their job currently, you definitely saw a lot of change. And so it's just another example of how we are dynamic and our world is dynamic, and that if we're really going to be looking at assessment results, theoretically, they should be aligning with some of those life forces.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if you guys published that. I'd love to see a little more of that. Maybe we could link people to any of that or any of that analysis as part of this podcast.
Yeah.
So interesting. There's a lot of data there, right? And we've been collecting a ton of data over the last decade on people and what they do and what they like and how good they are at it, et cetera. It's an overwhelming amount of information. It can't be internalized by some manager who has 15 or 20 direct reports, or even, quite frankly, the individual employee who probably in the past didn't have access to that data. And now in many situations, they do have access to that data and how it can help them evolve. That I see as tech has really helped with that area and made things a lot more easy and more timely, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's the access to data, the ability to see data in real time, whether through visualizations or through easy user experience mediums that allow you to get a feel for where you are, low to high on some characteristic or dimension in real time, has increased tremendously. And part of it has been, I think, the whole tracking mantra. I mean, we track everything in life, right? We track our macros, we track our sleep, we track, you name it, we track our time. So that trend has been coming for a long time. And now that we have apps and smartphones and data literacy, all that's becoming more prevalent, including in the workplace now, it's becoming more expected. I want to know how I'm doing today. I want feedback immediately. We all want feedback. That's an innate part of being an organizational participant. And when you have metrics that allow you, or mediums that allow you to see these metrics, it helps you understand what you need to know right now, like in the moment. Because it's not enough to just do the annual performance review. It's not enough to even do it quarterly. People need to know in the moment how they're doing and why, and be able to self-reflect so that they can make changes. Because if all you're doing is reflecting over the past year or the past quarter, and you don't have enough of that nuance, you don't have enough of that context to remember what exactly was going on. So that's number one. And then number two, AI has played a big role in helping people figure out, okay, what do I do with it? So think of it this way. There's technology platforms out there in the HRIS space that are taking the data that is extracted from some type of input, whether it is passive, such as your communication within a medium like Teams or Slack, or it is proactive, such as asking people to fill out surveys and like a pulse engagement survey type approach. Those are being used as the inputs that then create some type of output, which then triggers specific AI generated recommendations on what to do. So those could be for those individuals or for their managers or for key decision makers within the organization. So not only do we have data layered on top of that, we're starting to get more sophisticated. It's not quite there, but it's getting there in terms of programming machine learning to generate insights, recommendations on what to do next, which is fascinating, right? That whole performance development process could be potentially more automated than what it was previously.
Yeah. And those nudges, I know in this case, I think these work very well to remind people of either what they've got, what they should do, what might be their next step, that kind of thing. I know people get a little bit, have mixed emotion about the word nudges, but I think in this situation, to me, it makes a lot of sense that you're getting information from a vast amount of data served up to you that says, you know what, this might be the right time to do X.
Yeah. And what's interesting, so yes, I love the concept of nudges or micro interventions. And to add what I think is a little bit of commentary to that whole discussion. So interestingly, the phrase nudges came from behavioral economics. And they were specifically interested in understanding how to change human behavior in mass using frameworks that essentially took advantage of the fact that human beings by nature simplify and will gravitate towards suggestions. So if the default is X, you more than likely will do the default of X. It's that type of thing. And some people have said, oh, that feels manipulative. That doesn't seem genuine. And there's all sorts of interesting theoretical and philosophical arguments that surround that. I think actually a better term that gets away from that connotation is the more technical psychology-based term, which is micro interventions. So psychologists and also, all sorts of social scientists at large have been doing interventions as a way to experiment to see what happens when you offer somebody a workshop or a clinical conversation or some kind of therapy or anything along those lines. And the interventions, though, were spaced out across time. And so you had a hard time kind of pinning down, did it work forever? Because it was this 1 month or 3 month ordeal and then it's over. The concept of micro interventions is more so about highlighting that instead of one big massive data dump or one big massive experience, it needs to be trickled in over time in smaller amounts with more manageable information. And the theoretical perspective is from what's called social information processing theory or information processing theory in general. And this is like psychology 101 that basically says no human being can internalize or be attuned to more than X bits of information at once. We're incapable of really doing it. And we are incapable of holding in our working memory more than X bits of information at a time. So it's like the computer RAM for the brain. And then we only actually have so much capacity to take that working memory into long-term memory. So this is why when you're sitting in class, for example, and you're getting bombarded with information and taking notes and looking at slides, this is why you only remember 10% of it a year later, if that. It's because the human brain can't handle that much information in that approach. That's information processing theory. So why don't we apply the same type of thinking to human capital interventions and people operations? We need to be offering micro interventions that are small, actionable, digestible nudges across time and in the right context, so that over time, everything is digested and applied so that we actually remember everything that we're taught. So this idea of micro nudges versus one-time data dumps, that's the third pillar right there in terms of the potential radical change for assessments in the future.
Yeah. It sounds like the panacea, right? We'd all like to remember more of what we learn. And as with any job related work, you tend to learn, most people learn better by doing. But there's a lot of information that people gather through conversation, through meetings, through the same kind of principles that we used in school, and that need to be internalized or remembered or managed in some way. And who doesn't love what's the 3-step process? I can do this. Tell me what the 3 steps are.
Yeah, right. I'm really glad you said that. You pointed that out. It really goes back to just what we know about pedagogy and education. I mean, we know that people are way more likely to not just remember the content in the future, but also act upon the content in the future. So self-regulation theory, if it is learned in a way that is experiential. So a long time ago, the professors of the world, the academic eggheads, would stand up on stage in those weird robes that people wear to graduation now, and they would profess their knowledge for hours and hours on end, and people would just listen. And that's outdated. So we know that people learn better when it is experiential. You give them something to sink their teeth into, they experience it, they have a rich set of details. And this is where the whole case method kind of comes from as well. But then we've gone even beyond that. And now we have simulations, we have role plays, and we have like all of those are getting closer and closer to experiential learning. But it still ends up being not enough. I mean, every single day, I can count 10 things that already happened just before lunch that were probably opportunities that if I had the wherewithal and the mental space to really flesh it out and self-reflect, that I could have learned something. And so why don't we have mechanisms that allowed us to do it in real time? Well, it just hasn't quite gotten there, but it will eventually. And I think micro nudges are part of that solution.
Yeah. Do you have a good example or case study? And you don't have to mention the client name if you don't want, but of where you're seeing somebody acting in this space today where they're really doing some things that are differentiators?
Yeah, I think there's a few that I can reference. Absolutely. So working with Cloverleaf for sure. We have a few, we have more than a few. We have lots of clients that are taking advantage of the automated coaching approach, which is, it definitely is, it's kind of abiding by these, I think, radical innovations of being more dynamic, of getting the right amount, the right mix, and micro nudges. Actually, it was just earlier today, I was doing a presentation for a conference on measuring HR and proving the value of HR, and doing a pretty technical tutorial on how to do it the right way to really show that there is a change that's happening when you're doing any type of HR initiative over time. And the combination of looking at what we would call digital exhaust, so things that are passively collected in terms of data that can be analyzed just from the usage of some type of platform or some type of communication medium, whatever it might be, to be able to then pair that with whatever the success metrics of interest are. So we have one large publicly traded client that had a ton of sales personnel that were coming in cohorts. And they wanted to be able to do some pilots to help them figure out two things. Number one, how do you increase the extent to which they're leveraging their strengths? So very much a strengths-based company. They believe in Clifton and Gallup and that whole approach, which is the StrengthsFinder assessments, one of the assessments on Cloverleaf.
Right. And
they also really care about psychological safety, which a lot of companies do. That's a really important construct for high quality team interaction. So psych safety is essentially Amy Edmondson's idea that you want people that feel comfortable speaking up, admitting mistakes, and asking questions within team settings. They were really curious about whether or not this could help with that. So it was more like a collective team effort sales approach. And what we did is this pilot where we asked those two success metrics and a bunch of others before they used the intervention, and then had everybody use the platform, getting micro nudges and micro interventions and seeing all these assessment data in real time, and did it for about 3 months, and then had them fill out the success metrics again at time 2, and then ran all the results. And what's interesting is they were sophisticated enough to understand that you need to be able to tie the objective data, the usage data, with the outcome data. So most organizations would just say, oh, I'm going to look at time 1 versus time 2, just average what those two scores are and compare the two. And interestingly, if you compared the two, it was no difference. There was no difference in strength awareness, safety from time 1 to time 2. If you were to just compare those. But when you started to look at the impact of the engagement on the platform on whether or not the success metrics increased over time, you saw a substantial increase to the point where people that used it daily had anywhere from a 12 to a 20% increase in those different outcomes. And so it's the organizations that are really trying to understand the day-to-day active usage of some type of intervention. What type of impact does it have on behavior change across time? Those are the organizations that I think are doing the best job of kind of figuring out how to leverage assessments appropriately.
Yeah. And I think that's the kind of thing that HR and talent and OD people want to know, right? They want to be able to leverage this information. They want to be thinking about how they're going to plug AI into this process, or And in most cases, it's already plugged into many of the technologies. It's, are we leveraging it properly and are we taking advantage? And are we structured to really manage the data that's coming in?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so actually, the name of this talk that I was giving earlier was called Show Me the Money, Measuring the Value of HR. So Show Me the Money is a reference back to Jerry Maguire, where he's the sports agent who basically only has one client left. And his one client is quite the character, Cuba Gooding Jr. There's that famous scene where Cuba Gooding Jr. is screaming in the phone, "Show me the money, Jerry, show me the money." And then Jerry Maguire has to totally throw his ego under the rug and he's screaming, "Show me the money." That is very much a big trigger, I think, for anybody in human resources and L&D and training and development, everybody in our space, that we are constantly being asked, what's the impact and how does it work? And show me the dollars, what is the actual impact? And so if we really want to see at the table, we got to get better at actually understanding this day-to-day interventions and day-to-day usage and what the impact is across time. And also another interesting kind of sideline story to this, if you really think about the rise of the chief marketing officer, in the 60s, there was really no such thing as a chief marketing officer. It was just whoever the COO or CEO is investing in advertising. And the rise of the CMO, you could see a sharp increase in terms of that being an actual title, came in the 90s. Well, what else happened in the 90s? Internet marketing. The reason that CMOs started to get a seat at the table was because they were able to quantify and track their investments and how much a return on investment it became in terms of how many marketing dollars were spent, how much revenue did this bring in as a result of those clicks and those click-throughs and those view rates and everything else, right? So HR has to do the same thing, right? We got to get better at being able to quantify what exactly is going on so that not only do we already, to some degree, have a seat at the table, but we're taken more seriously in terms of the value of people operations in general.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And we saw in our survey last year that when organizations assess themselves, their HR function from a strategic perspective, that they were only sitting at about 46%, while their colleagues in finance and supply chain were 60 and 70% viewed as strategic by the organization. And we kind of put some time around that last year to kind of drive that message forward and help organizations think more strategically, especially from an HR perspective. And I think what you just described is how do we show our value in real terms? And there's all kinds of ways to do that now. And it's becoming more prevalent.
I agree. Yep. It's data-driven now.
It's all data-driven. And the CMO examples is a very good one. We have the same types of data now from an HR perspective. And I think that's something we could strive for.
Yeah.
If you could, one of the things I like to do with this audience is leave them with one thing that will help them get to work on this particular problem or challenge, something that they could start doing today that would be sort of put them on a path. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I think some of the suggestions entail getting really comfortable with, and this is going to sound very nerdy, but I promise it's fun, is getting very comfortable with research methods and data analysis. And I'm not talking master's level, PhD level stuff. I am just talking about the basics. And the more confident we can get with what is the best way to, for example, design a assessment of our own for targeting some specific metric of interest. What does this data actually mean that's being extracted from digital exhaust, from some system that everybody's already on? Some of those basics are going to be very helpful for making sure that we get the right information in so that we can track and understand the impact. And then also just getting comfortable with some of the basics of analysis and just understanding the difference between correlation and causation and what types of tools can we use. Believe it or not, Excel, if you do some add-ins, can do a whole lot of stuff for free. There's also free tools out there for stats. JASP, for example, I use all the time. It's free. You can download it. It's a GUI interface that sits over R, and you can pretty much do anything. You don't have to pay $1,000 for the IBM SPSS subscription every year. I think not being afraid to dive in. You can learn so much by just looking at YouTube. I mean, just because it's not traditionally thought of as a quantitative domain or department or area doesn't mean that we can't turn it into that. So that'd probably be the first one. And then I think in terms of assessments in particular, which is kind of where we started, I think it's really kind of starting to question, is this enough? Is this really getting at what we want it to be? Because if you're simply using an assessment as a way to screen, which is a whole nother conversation on whether or not that's a good idea, or if you're using it for leadership development discussions or team development discussions that are kind of one and done, really are you taking full advantage of that information? And really start to be critical of how much the spend is for a static assessment approach, and think about how it can be incorporated into more of a daily ongoing experience where people are being asked to reflect all the time. I mean, I've done dozens of data collections on leadership development, and I genuinely think the desire is there. Employees want more feedback. They want to grow. They want to develop on a daily basis. And they are not satisfied by showing up for one online session or to be offshored or delegated to something else, and that's it, and it's checking the box. I think they want more than that. And I also see research illustrating that those personas that do pursue that type of behavior over the long term, they're the ones that end up rising throughout the organization, A. So that's more of an objective success metric. And B, they end up being the ones that are happier. They find themselves in positions where their job satisfaction is higher, their team satisfaction is higher, and they get more meaning and fulfillment out of the work that they do. So it's kind of it's good for all.
Yeah, I read the book Flow by Csikszentmihalyi. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I'm guessing you probably absolutely are. And it makes me think about that, where that really is, no matter what the job is, if you're in the flow and you're happy doing it, that's really what matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great construct. It's that feeling that time is flying by and your skill set perfectly aligns with the challenge that you find yourself in. And you inevitably, again, people change, right? So things that were challenging today won't be challenging a month or a year from now. So it's always evolving, and we have to continually kind of figure out how to reset and make sure that we're giving ourselves a challenge that's the next challenge that we can then get into flow, because now we've learned more and it's going to align with this new challenge, and then it keeps moving forward. And that process of finding a work environment that is in perfect alignment with yourself, that allows you to be in flow for the majority of your workday, is an ongoing process. It's not a one and done type of thing.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation, Scott. Thank you for joining me today. I know people can find you out on LinkedIn and on your various socials. Is there any place else you might suggest people go to read more from you?
Yeah, a splash page to pretty much everything I have is scottdust.com. So first name, last name.com. It's got all the socials and everything else. Also encourage people to check out cloverleaf.me if that's of interest in terms of understanding how to take assessments to the next level, to be able to use them for automated coaching.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I want to thank our producers, Brand Method Media. I want to thank the marketing team, and thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. That's all we have today for this episode of HR We Have a Problem. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to us on your favorite podcast. And we'd love it if you leave us a review if you have a minute, or drop us a line on the website, or schedule a chat. We'd love to hear more from you and love to hear what topics you might like us to cover in the future. We will be back in 2 weeks with another episode of HR We Have a Problem. Thanks, everybody.